And while White and his colleagues danced, what was going on inside the brain of that monkey? I asked him what he imagined it must have been like, to find yourself suddenly reduced to your thoughts. I am, of course, not the first journalist to have asked this question. The legendary Oriana Falici asked it of White's neurophysiologist Leo Massapust in a Look magazine interview in November 1967. I suspect that without his senses he can think more quickly, Dr. Massapust answered brightly. What kind of thinking, I don't know. I guess he's primarily a memory, a repository for information stored when he had his flesh. He cannot develop further because he no longer has the nourishment of experience. Yet this, too, is a new experience. White declines to sugarcoat. He mentions the isolation chamber studies of the 1970s, wherein subjects had no sensory input, nothing to see, hear, smell, feel, or taste. These people got as close as you can come, without White's aid, to being brains in a box. People in these conditions have gone literally crazy, says White, and it doesn't take all that long. Although insanity, too, is a new experience for most people, no one was likely to volunteer to become one of White's isolated brains. And, of course, White couldn't force anyone to do it. So what justified putting a rhesus monkey through this? It turns out the isolated brain experiments were simply a step on the way toward keeping entire heads alive on new bodies. By the time White appeared on the scene, early immunosuppressive drugs were available, and many of the problems of tissue rejection were being resolved. If White and his team worked out the kinks with the brains and found out they could be kept functioning, then they would move on to whole heads, first monkey heads, and then, they hoped, human ones. White thinks of the operation not as a head transplant, but as a whole body transplant. Think of it this way. Instead of getting one or two donated organs, a dying recipient gets the entire body of a brain-dead beating heart cadaver. Unlike Guthrie and Demikov with their multi-headed monsters, White would remove the body donor's head and put the new one in its place. The logical recipient of this new body, as White envisions it, would be a quadriplegic. For one thing, White said, the lifespan of quadriplegics is typically reduced, their organs giving out more quickly than is normal. By putting them, their heads, onto new bodies, you would buy them a decade or two of life, without, in their case, much altering to their quality of life. High-level quadriplegics are paralyzed from the neck down and require artificial respiration, but everything from the neck up works fine. Ditto the transplanted head. Because no neurosurgeon can yet reconnect severed spinal nerves, the person would still be a quadriplegic, but no longer one with a death sentence. The head could hear, taste, see, says White. It could read and hear music, and the neck can be instrumented just like Mr. Reeves is to speak. In 1971, White achieved the unthinkable. He cut the head off of one monkey and connected it to the base of the neck of a second decapitated monkey. The operation lasted 8 hours and required numerous assistants, each having been given detailed instructions, including where to stand and what to say. White went up to the operating room for weeks beforehand and marked off everyone's position on the floor with chalk circles and arrows, like a football coach. The first step was to give the monkeys tracheotomies and hook them up to respirators, for their windpipes were about to be severed. The next White pared the two monkeys' necks down to just the spine and the main blood vessels, the two carotid arteries carrying blood to the brain, and the two jugular veins bringing it back to the heart. Then he whittled down the bone at the top of the body donor's neck and capped it with a metal plate, and did the same thing on the bottom of the head. After the vessels were reconnected, the two plates were screwed together. Then, using long, flexible tubing, he brought the circulation of the donor body over to supply its new head and sutured the vessels. Finally, the head was cut off from the blood supply of its old body. What would have gotten to me was the look on the monkey's face when the anesthesia wore off and it realized what had just taken place. White described this moment in the aforementioned paper, Cephalic Exchange Transplantation in the Monkey. Each cephalon, or head, gave the evidence of the external environment. The eyes tracked the movements of individuals and objects brought into their visual fields, and the cephalons remained basically pugnacious in their attitudes, as demonstrated by their biting if orally stimulated. When White placed food in their mouths, they chewed it and attempted to swallow it, a bit of a dirty trick, given that the esophagus hadn't been reconnected and was now dead-end. The monkeys lived anywhere from 6 hours to 3 days, most of them dying from rejection issues or from bleeding. In order to prevent clotting the anastomosed arteries, the animals were on anticoagulants, which created their own problems. White doesn't think the United States will be the likely site of the first human head transplant, owing to the amount of bureaucracy and institutional resistance faced by inventors of radical new procedures. You're dealing with an operation that is totally revolutionary. People can't make up their minds whether it's a total body transplant or a head transplant, a brain or even a soul transplant. There's another issue too. People will say, look at all those people's lives you could save with the organs in one body, and you want to give that body to just one person, and he's paralyzed. A lot of other countries want him to do it, but where's the money? Even in the United States, cost stands in the way. As White points out, who's going to fund the research when the operation is so expensive and would only benefit a small number of patients? Insurance companies are unlikely to ever cover such an expensive operation, which would put this particular form of life extension out of reach of anyone but the very rich. Is it a sensible use of medical resources to keep terminally ill and extravagantly wealthy people alive? Shouldn't we, as a culture, encourage a saner, more accepting attitude toward death? White doesn't profess to have the last word on the matter, but he'd still like to do it. A single organ removed from a body becomes impersonal, identity neutral. The humanitarian benefits of its donation outweigh the emotional discomfort surrounding its removal, for most of us anyway. Body transplants are another story. Will people or their families ever give an entire intact body away to improve the health of a stranger?